When a man becomes more than a leader, when his name begins to echo not just across the borders of his country, but across the deserts of Mali, the forests of Burkina Faso, the hills of Niger, and the bustling streets of Abidjan, know that something far greater than politics is unfolding. This is the story of Ibrahim Traore, the young leader of Burkina Faso, whose presence has stirred both admiration and criticism. Recently, a voice from Côte d'Ivoire, Kamille Makoso, challenged this wave, calling it mere publicity, a passing buzz. But what Makoso may not realize is this: when the voice of Africa rises, it is not for show, it is for liberation. Tensions rise, allegiances shift, a digital firestorm brews between voices of unity and voices of division. What's really at stake is not the pride of two men, but the soul of a continent. Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It's the future our elders prayed for. Subscribe and stand with us for an Africa that will never bow again. It began not with bullets, but with words. And in today's Africa, words can carry the weight of revolutions. Kamille Makoso, a controversial Ivorian social media personality and self-styled influencer of politics and pop culture, stood before his online audience with a message. Toute chose a une fin, tout buzz a des limites, he declared. Everything has an end, every buzz has its limit. He was referring to Ibrahim Traore, the young military leader of Burkina Faso, and by implication, the swelling movement of African sovereignty that Traore now symbolizes. To the casual viewer, it may have seemed like a typical online rant, another clash of personalities in the theater of social media. But to millions of Africans, particularly those in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, it was a direct provocation. A dismissal of their pain, their fight, their dream. Makoso's words landed like a slap, especially when he said, "Affaire d'Ibrahim Traore, là, c'est pas un buzz, hein?" The statement, meant perhaps to discredit, instead ignited. He went further, mocking not only Traore but the very foundation of the AES Alliance, Alliance des États du Sahel, the united front formed by Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger to reject French military presence and push back against neocolonial influence. In response, a storm erupted, not from official channels, but from the people. Across platforms from YouTube to TikTok to WhatsApp groups in Ouagadougou, Niamey and Bamako, supporters of Ibrahim Traore responded with force. They denounced Makoso's speech as insulting, ignorant, and, perhaps most dangerously, divisive. Traore is not a showman, one speaker replied in a viral clip. He is a signal fire. A symbol, a call to consciousness. The speaker was not alone. Echoes came from across the Sahel. Traore is not alone. Do you see Assimi Goïta of Mali doing interviews? Do you hear Abdourahmane Tiani of Niger making noise? No, they lead in silence because they are building something bigger than themselves, and Ibrahim is part of that. This was more than just a defense of one man. It was the articulation of a generation's frustration. They are tired of puppet governments, tired of decisions made in Paris or Washington without consultation, tired of being told what democracy should look like while their resources disappear into foreign hands. And so they stood behind the young man in military fatigues with a calm voice and a sharp message. The timeline is telling. October 2022. Ibrahim Traore comes to power in Burkina Faso through a military coup, citing the government's failure to deal with Islamist insurgencies. January 2023. French troops are formally asked to leave Burkina Faso. August 2023, Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger sign a mutual defense pact, the AES. Mid-2024, Western media intensifies criticism of Traore's leadership style, calling it undemocratic and dangerous. August 2025, Makoso's video hits social media, questioning the authenticity of Traore's revolution. In just under 3 years, Traore had gone from an obscure army captain to a face of Africa rising. He speaks rarely, but when he does, his words are replayed like sermons. He is no Thomas Sankara, but many call him Sankara's spiritual son. So when Makoso made his remarks, particularly aligning himself with President Alassane Ouattara of Côte d'Ivoire, a known ally of France, it struck a nerve. The video was not just a jab at Traore. It was a reminder of the larger fault line dividing African leadership. Those who still embrace colonial ties under the guise of economic diplomacy and those who reject it outright. Makoso said, "Nous ne sommes pas vos camarades. We are not your peers." The implication was clear. Côte d'Ivoire stands above Burkina Faso, but to many across Africa, this arrogance was not only unfounded, it was dangerous, because what happens when Africans turn against each other while the true enemies sit quietly in boardrooms in Paris, Brussels, and Washington? What happens when ridicule is used not to debate, but to divide? This was not merely a social media feud, it was a battle for narrative, and in a continent where history has been written by outsiders, reclaiming that narrative is revolutionary and, yet, through all the uproar, Ibrahim Traore remained silent. No tweet, no speech, no retaliation, just the silence of a man whose presence says more than his words. Supporters interpreted this as wisdom. "Let the dogs bark," said one commentator from Mali. The lion does not respond, but the streets were not silent. Debates raged from Yaoundé to Cotonou. Elders nodded in quiet approval, while the youth raised placards and phones alike. Was Makoso speaking for himself, or for something more sinister? The cliffhanger lies here, not in the insult, but in the intent. Cliffhanger. But was this just a war of words, or the first spark in a fire long overdue? In the hours and days following Kamille Makoso's video, the African digital landscape erupted, not in polite disagreement, but in a roar. Hashtags surged, videos multiplied, phone lines buzzed from Conakry to Ouagadougou. Something deeper than political commentary had been disturbed. The people were no longer simply reacting, they were rising. And at the center of it all was one question: how dare you mock a movement born from suffering? For the supporters of Ibrahim Traore, Makoso's words were not merely offensive, they were sacrilegious. Traore was not trending for fame. He had not risen through dance videos or comedy skits. He had taken power in a time of war, with dust still clinging to his boots, while villages in Burkina Faso mourned the dead from jihadist attacks and foreign neglect. In their eyes, Makoso represented everything wrong with modern African politics: loud, shallow, performative, and blind to the undercurrents of neocolonial manipulation. But this was no longer just about him. The video brought to the surface a tension long bubbling beneath the surface. The division between African nations aligned with Western powers, and those choosing to walk away. Nowhere was this divide clearer than in the contrasting images pouring across social media. In Abidjan, influencers and politicians praised President Alassane Ouattara's stability, economic ties with France, and leadership in ECOWAS. In Ouagadougou, young men painted murals of Traore next to Sankara, holding up banners that read "Liberté ou la mort." The emotional climax came when an unnamed Burkinabe speaker posted a 6-minute video response that quickly gained over 2 million views in just 48 hours. He sat on a wooden stool, face calm but eyes blazing. He said, "You joke about Traore, but would you dare joke about Sankara? Because that is who he carries in his heart. You praise Ouattara, but when did he ask the Ivorian people whether they wanted France's hand in their pocket? You laugh, but this is not a joke. This is our land, our blood, our silence breaking." That video became a watershed moment. It was shared in WhatsApp groups among taxi drivers, traders, university students, and even retired soldiers. It touched a nerve not just in Burkina Faso, but across the Francophone continent. Even in Senegal and Cameroon, citizens began asking, "Are we next?" And then came the whispers of something far deeper, more unsettling. Across encrypted channels and private groups, the fear began to spread. Was Makoso's video part of something bigger? A campaign? A manipulation? Some claimed he had received funding to stir controversy. Others said he was just a pawn, unaware of how his voice could be weaponized against unity. Whatever the truth, the impact was undeniable. Even local Ivorian voices, journalists, religious leaders, professors, began to express unease. "Yes, we may not agree with the methods of the AES alliance," one pastor stated in a televised sermon, "but we cannot mock those dying for Africa's independence. That is not brotherhood, that is betrayal." The media too began to shift. At first hesitant, some outlets began cautiously exploring both sides. A Burkina-based radio station interviewed villagers who spoke of how Traore had brought hope, where there had been none. In Mali, artists released spoken word pieces calling out hypocrisy among African elites. In Niger, a youth group marched silently in protest, carrying only candles and one sign: "Mock our president, and you mock our pain." This was no longer a Makoso versus Traore feud. It had become something larger. In the digital trenches, battle lines were drawn. One side argued, "Traore is not elected. He is dangerous. Africa needs democracy, not military men." The other side countered, "We had democracy, and it gave us puppets. Traore is not perfect, but he listens and he acts. That is what we need now." And through it all, Ibrahim Traore said nothing. No press conference, no social media post, no condemnation of Makoso. It was as if he knew, when you speak for the people, they will speak for you. That silence was not weakness. It became strategy. While critics shouted Traore built alliances, while influencers posted he visited wounded soldiers. While pundits argued he opened new schools in zones once abandoned. His silence spoke louder than the noise. International observers began to notice. Western media, while continuing to brand him authoritarian, could not ignore the growing loyalty he commanded. CNN, BBC, and France 24 ran cautious stories about African realignment, populist military leaders, and growing anti-French sentiment. But none could quite explain why the crowds kept growing, or why their cameras could not look away from his face. The digital battle had revealed something more powerful than algorithms or headlines: a hunger. A hunger for sovereignty, a hunger for truth. A hunger to be heard after generations of being spoken for. And in that space, Ibrahim Traore had become more than a man. He was becoming a myth. But myths are fragile. They are either carried by the people or crushed by betrayal. The question now was simple: would this wave carry Africa forward or crash on the rocks of old divisions? And while the digital drums of war sounded louder, an older force began to stir, one not seen since the days of Kwame Nkrumah. While the digital space seethed with emotion, on the ground the echoes of this feud began to manifest in more tangible, more troubling ways. The streets of Ouagadougou, Abidjan, and even Cotonou were no longer just arenas of traffic and trade. They had become forums of whispered fears and open declarations. What began as a social media conflict was now being felt in marketplaces, in classrooms, in sermons, and in strategy rooms. The first signs of shift came quietly. In Burkina Faso, publics, sentiment grew more defensive, not just of Ibrahim Traore, but of their entire national sovereignty. Cafes that once played Afrobeats now tuned into political discussions. Graffiti praising AES leaders began to appear on old colonial buildings, and beneath it all, a sense of siege settled in. "We are surrounded," one merchant told a reporter, anonymously. Côte d'Ivoire to the south, Benin to the southeast, countries still dancing with France. "We don't want war, but we won't bow either." This rhetoric wasn't isolated. In Mali, communities near the Ivorian border reported increased military patrols. Though no violence had broken out, the tension was unmistakable. Each nation claimed it was only responding to heightened regional sensitivities, but locals knew better. Something was shifting, and inside Côte d'Ivoire, the division deepened. Makoso's comments may have sparked outrage in the Sahel, but within his own borders they opened a Pandora's box. Was he right to defend Ouattara's relationship with France? Should Côte d'Ivoire re-examine its position in light of the Pan-African wave? University students began staging debates on campus lawns. Traore versus Ouattara, who truly leads for Africa? Panel discussions aired on late-night radio. Elders shook their heads with caution, while youth dared to speak the unspeakable. What if we joined them? That, of course, was unthinkable to the Ivorian elite. Government spokespeople reaffirmed their position. Côte d'Ivoire remains committed to regional stability and international partnerships, especially with France and the United States. But for many, the use of the word partnership was starting to sound like another form of possession. In Burkina Faso, the government took a more assertive stance. While Traore himself remained silent, key figures in the transition government released statements condemning external interference and attempts to delegitimize Africa's sovereign path. There were rumors, denied officially, that AES was reviewing border policies with ECOWAS-aligned states. The mere suggestion was enough to cause panic among traders and transporters who rely on cross-border commerce. Markets in Bobo Dioulasso saw a drop in imported goods. Prices rose. Tempers flared. But economic hardship wasn't the only concern. Civil society began to feel the weight of the political storm. Journalists faced new pressures. Some were warned not to glorify anti-Western narratives, while others were cautioned against criticizing the AES. In Côte d'Ivoire, one independent reporter was detained briefly after sharing a video defending Traore's policies. And amidst all this, everyday people grew anxious. In churches, pastors prayed for unity. In mosques, imams called for wisdom. At family tables, arguments grew heated as parents and children found themselves on different sides of the ideological divide. Because this was no longer just about leaders, it was about identity. What does it mean to be African today? Is freedom found in cooperating with old powers, or breaking from them entirely? Is democracy always the answer, even if it delivers corruption and foreign control? These were not easy questions, but they were necessary, and they were being asked not just in the capitals, but in dusty towns and rural schools, where the name Ibrahim Traore now joined the likes of Sankara and Lumumba, on classroom walls. This awakening came with risk. Political groups, once dormant, began to reactivate. Some called for deeper integration among AES countries, proposing a new regional currency independent of the CFA franc. Others demanded referendums on foreign bases. Still others warned that such dreams, if rushed, could plunge West Africa into chaos. In response, the governments of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso released a joint statement reaffirming their commitment to peaceful transition and long-term stability, but also their refusal to return to the old order. They used a new phrase, Pan-African sovereignty. Not independence for one nation, but interdependence among Africans, without foreign strings attached. That phrase struck a chord. Across social media, music videos, and protest chants, the call for Pan-African sovereignty grew. Young people in Togo, Ghana, and even South Africa began echoing the sentiment. What had begun as a defense of one man was morphing into a continental movement, but such momentum demands care. Can this wave be sustained without spiraling into violence or authoritarianism? Can it be channeled into education, innovation, and local development, or will it be hijacked by opportunists, by foreign agents, or by history's weight itself? At this crossroads, one reality stands clear. Africa is being forced to choose not just between leaders, but between futures, and the world is watching. If you believe this is what Africa needed all along, say amen in the comments below. Still one question echoed from every village to every capital. Will this be the crack that breaks the wall, or the light that shines through it? Far beyond the streets of Ouagadougou or the debate halls of Abidjan, another conversation has been quietly unfolding in embassies, military briefings, and boardrooms across Europe and North America. Because while Makoso's video may have sparked a fire online, the real blaze that concerns foreign powers is the growing defiance from Africa's Sahel and the man who now symbolizes it, Ibrahim Traore. For France, the writing has been on the wall for some time. Once the unquestioned authority across Francophone Africa, Paris now finds itself unwelcome in capitals where it once held military command. The expulsion of French troops from Burkina Faso in early 2023 marked not just a tactical shift, but a psychological rupture, and it didn't stop there. Mali had already shown France the door. Niger, under Tiani, followed suit with even greater defiance. And now, with the rise of the AES alliance, there is talk of a France exit, an entire bloc walking away from French economic, military, and diplomatic influence. France has responded with a mix of denial and pressure. Officials urge dialogue, while media outlets label Traore and his counterparts as authoritarian populists. The irony is not lost on African observers, how quickly leaders become dictators when they stop listening to Paris. Meanwhile, the United States plays a more nuanced game. Publicly, Washington affirms its commitment to African peace and democracy. Behind closed doors, however, cables leak with concerns over growing Russian and Chinese influence in the Sahel. American officials have quietly expressed fears that if leaders like Traore continue to gain popularity, the US may lose a strategic corridor in West Africa, one crucial for counterterrorism, economic access, and resource extraction. Washington's strategy for now is soft containment, strengthen ties with moderate leaders like Alassane Ouattara in Côte d'Ivoire and Macky Sall in Senegal, provide funding and training under the guise of anti-terror cooperation. Increase diplomatic pressure on ECOWAS to isolate the AES bloc. But this containment is fragile, especially when the people, young, urban, connected, are choosing new heroes. Elsewhere, Russia watches with quiet satisfaction. Wagner operatives have already found footholds in Mali. State-backed media like RT Afrique amplify Traore's speeches with near messianic tone. For the Kremlin, this is more than geopolitical. It is psychological warfare against the West. China, more reserved, continues its economic advance, roads, hospitals, ports, all under the Belt and Road banner. Though Beijing avoids ideological alliances, it is happy to profit from the West's fading grip. Back on the continent, ECOWAS, once seen as a platform for regional unity, now finds itself in a crisis of credibility. Accused of acting as a proxy for French and American interests, its sanctions on Mali and Niger have backfired. Rather than isolating these countries, they've hardened their resolve. The African Union remains cautious. Its statements are measured, its interventions limited. But for many, that caution reads as impotence. In the face of a historical realignment, silence is complicity. What none of these actors fully grasp, what they fail to account for in their think tanks and policy memos, is the emotional gravity of Africa rising. This isn't about military bases or trade agreements. It's about memory, about a continent tired of being told what to do, how to vote, and who to admire. And in this landscape, even a viral video like Makoso's is no longer personal. It becomes geopolitical. Because every insult, every defense, every silence carries weight. And for the West, the question now is not how to stop the revolution, but how to avoid being crushed beneath it. And if history has taught us anything, it's that Africa is never truly left alone. But is this the final chapter, or just the prelude to true freedom? Africa stands at a historic fork in the road. The echoes of Makoso's video may fade. The headlines about Ibrahim Traore may be replaced. But the questions they unleashed, those will not go away. Because something has changed. A new generation, born after independence but still shackled by its ghosts, is waking up. They no longer accept the lie that sovereignty means choosing between French or American approval. They know that Africa rising is not a phrase, it is a promise, long overdue. So where do we go from here? First, Africa must confront the reality of division. It is not enough to blame imperialists and walk away. Unity cannot be proclaimed, it must be built. This means forging alliances not of convenience, but of conscience. Not between governments, but between peoples. The AES alliance may be the beginning, but it cannot be the end. If Ibrahim Traore is serious about his Pan-African vision, then he must not only lead the military and denounce neocolonialism, he must also build schools, protect women, promote free press, and empower a culture of civic participation. Otherwise, revolution risks becoming yet another throne. Secondly, Africa must reclaim its economic dignity. The CFA franc, colonial contracts, debt traps, all must be scrutinized, renegotiated, or rejected, but not recklessly. A continent of 1.4 billion must not trade one master for another. Sovereignty means self-reliance, but also interdependence among African nations. Third, the battle must be fought in the minds and media. The reason Makoso's video went viral is not just controversy, it is that Africa still lacks its own channels of truth. 1,000 YouTube voices must rise to tell our stories, unfiltered by Paris or Washington. Platforms like Africa Rising Voice must not be the exception, they must be the norm. And finally, the greatest work lies in healing our imagination. Colonization didn't just steal land, it stole confidence. For too long, Africans have been taught that order comes from outside, that discipline is European, that salvation wears a suit and speaks French or English. But what if the future wears Faso dan Fani cloth? What if it sounds like djembe drums and speaks Mande or Kiswahili? What if it looks like a young captain named Ibrahim Traore, standing not just for Burkina Faso, but for every forgotten village, every silenced elder, every child taught to bow, before they could run. This is the path of Africa rising. It is not easy, it is not perfect, but it is ours, and the time is now. Because if we do not choose the road ourselves, others will choose it for us. And if one voice can awaken a continent, what happens when we all speak as one? This was never just about Kamille Makoso, nor was it solely about Ibrahim Traore. This is the mirror Africa holds to itself, asking what kind of future it dares to imagine. A future ruled by fear and foreign puppetry, or one shaped by courage, clarity, and a continent finally speaking its truth? Traore may be young, he may be imperfect, but in this moment he represents something far greater than military command. He is a crack in the old colonial ceiling, a ripple in the silence, a symbol that even the most forgotten nation can rise and remind the world, we are still here and we are still ours. The outcry sparked by one video is not a distraction, it is a revelation. It reminds us how fragile our unity is and how powerful our voice can be when raised together. So let this not be just another chapter in the drama of politics. Let it be a call. A call to all who believe in the dignity of Africa, not the Africa drawn on maps, but the Africa beating in our chests. Let us dream boldly, act wisely, and walk with honor. Let us say it loudly, not just in hashtags or headlines, but in schools, in policies, in borders built with trust, not bullets. Let us rise, because Africa rising is not a moment, it is a mission. If this story moves something in your chest, do not just scroll. Like, share, and speak up. Subscribe. Our history was muted for too long. Let us say our future out loud. Type your truth below. Africa rise. Ibrahim Traore stands for us. The time is now.